해외의 키토 전문가 중에는 의사 출신이 많습니다. 그들은 환자를 치료하는 과정에서 혹은 의사인 자신이 대사건강 문제를 직접 경험하면서 지금껏 교육받고 실천해온 기존 의학의 한계를 깨닫고 키토다이어트를 연구하기 시작한 경우가 많죠. 그런데 오늘 소개할 벤 비크먼 박사는 조금 다른 길을 걸어왔습니다. 그는 의사가 아닌 생체 에너지 대사를 전공한 연구자로 인슐린과 대사장애, 그리고 키토다이어트의 작용 원리에 대해 더욱 근본적인 접근을 합니다. 이런 접근은 그가 단순한 임상 경험을 넘어 인체의 대사 문제를 연구하는 과학자이기 때문입니다. 그래서 그의 인터뷰는 평소 키토 관련 영상과는 조금 다르게 더 깊이 있는 생리학적 원리를 다루고 있습니다. 그래서 이 모든 내용을 이해하고 번역하는 과정도 쉽지 않았는데요. 처음엔 핵심적인 부분만 추려서 전달할까 고민도 했지만 모든 내용이 유기적으로 연결되어 있고 저희 구독자 여러분은 이런 깊이 있는 내용도 유익하게 받아들이실 수 있을 것 같아서 전체 인터뷰 내용을 준비했습니다. 그는 먼저 인슐린이 체중 감소, 정확히는 지방 분해를 어떻게 방해하는지에 대해 설명합니다.
Yeah, the primary mechanism is a direct inhibition of lipolysis. So lipolysis is the term we use to refer to the breakdown of fat from the fat cell. Now, people will often say fat burning, but that's not fat burning. Fat burning is the end fate. That's what the fat is going to go and do after it comes out of the fat cell. So before we ever have fat burning or the oxidation, we have the breakdown or the lipolysis. Insulin has this chokehold on lipolysis. And if insulin levels start to climb, it will inhibit lipolysis no matter what other stimulus is present. So you can try to be stimulating lipolysis with catecholamines like adrenaline, for example. And if insulin is elevated over, even slightly over fasted levels, it immediately starts to depress that signal to the point that once you've gone a couple multiples over fasted levels, which is very easy to do with insulin, you've shut off lipolysis entirely. So largely, the primary effect of insulin controlling weight loss is its effect on lipolysis. And again, to state that clearly, as insulin goes up, lipolysis drops. You shut it off. But as much as people don't acknowledge this, insulin absolutely influences the front end as well, which is the movement of fat. But it depends on the size of the fat cell. So while there's a lot of controversy and debate on insulin's ability or insulin's acting as a stimulus to pull the fat in to the fat cell, it depends on the size of the fat cell. Smaller fat cells, insulin does stimulate fatty acid uptake into the fat cells. So as much as it controls the back end of the fat cell by regulating lipolysis, it does in fact also influence the front end, particularly in smaller fat cells. And as the fat cell gets larger, that effect becomes somewhat diminished. And now insulin isn't controlling fat uptake, but it's still controlling the exit of it, so the leaving of the fat or the lipolysis. So with these two ideas combined, if someone can appreciate pretty quickly how insulin really does control the growth and the shrinking of the fat cell.
지방이 분해된다는 건 정확히 어떤 과정일까요? 우리 몸은 지방을 중성지방 형태로 저장합니다. 지방을 연소하기 위해서는 먼저 분해 과정이 필요한데요. 이 과정에서 중성지방이 글리세롤과 지방산으로 나뉘게 됩니다. 지방산은 혈액을 통해 근육이나 간으로 이동해 에너지원으로 사용되고 글리세롤은 간에서 포도당으로 전환될 수 있습니다. 즉, 몸속의 지방은 단순히 빠지는 것이 아니라 먼저 분해된 후 혈액을 통해 이동하고 최종적으로는 연소되어야 한다는 것입니다. 그런데 인슐린 수치가 높아지면 이 첫 단계인 지방 분해 자체가 차단됩니다. 이것은 마치 은행에 돈은 있지만 인출할 수 없는 상황과 비슷합니다. 인슐린이 지방이 빠져나오는 문을 닫아버리는 것이죠. 예를 들어 A라는 사람은 아침을 먹고 출근해서 달달한 커피를 마시고 입이 심심해서 작은 과자 하나를 먹고 점심을 먹습니다. B는 아침을 건너뛰고 공복 상태로 근무하다가 점심에 첫 식사를 합니다. A는 아침부터 점심까지 계속 음식을 섭취하면서 인슐린이 떨어질 기회, 다시 말하면 지방이 분해될 기회를 완전히 잃었습니다. 반면 B는 저녁부터 다음날 점심까지 공복 시간을 유지하며 인슐린을 낮추고 지방 분해가 일어날 시간을 확보할 수 있습니다. 이처럼 평범한 일상에서도 식습관에 따라 대사와 지방 축적에 엄청나게 큰 차이가 생길 수 있습니다. 이어서 벤 비크먼 박사는 지방세포의 크기에 관한 흥미로운 개념을 설명하는데요. 이 내용은 왜 한국인이 서양인보다 날씬한데도 당뇨병에 취약한지에 대한 결정적인 힌트를 제공합니다.
Is a small fat cell necessarily a new fat cell, or what defines a small or a large fat cell?
Yeah. So for me, when I'm saying define, I actually mean like on the order of microns, like how many micrometers is its diameter. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a new one, although it certainly could. But some people genetically have the ability to make new fat cells. And in fact, one of the sexes does in particular areas. But referencing some people first, a paper published decades ago found that in the average obese population, about 80% of this mixed ethnicity population has gotten obese through hypertrophy. So the number of fat cells hasn't changed, but the size of the fat cells have. So that's the hypertrophy of the fat cell, which is particularly pathogenic. When a fat cell gets big or fat, then it becomes very insulin resistant and very pro-inflammatory. However, a small fat cell, and this is again a subset, let's say about 15% of people who can become obese or do become obese, they have this genetic ability to continue to make new fat cells. And so to kind of come back to your question, those would be younger fat cells. They haven't had time to get big, but they also don't have the metabolic pressure to get big. Because in that individual who genetically can continue to make fat cells, every time the fat cell starts to get a little bit of growth pressure on it, it recruits a new fat cell. And so no fat cell ever gets too big. And those are the people who paradoxically can both become fantastically obese and yet still and not become type 2 diabetic and insulin resistant. And these are the people that they make TV shows about. The fact is, most people around the entire world could never get to 600 pounds. You and I, very, very likely, statistically, we could do everything we could to try to get to 600 pounds. And as the fat cells get bigger and bigger and bigger, they become more and more insulin resistant and thus become less sensitive to insulin signal, attempting to tell them to continue to get big. And that's because the fat cell can reach about 20 times its normal dimensions, which is unlike any cell. There's no cell in the body that can grow 20 times its kind of native size. But as the fat cell begins to approach this maximum dimension, it starts to become resistant to insulin, all in an effort to prevent itself from literally bursting like an overfilled water balloon. And so these people who genetically continue to make fat cells, they are getting fatter and fatter and fatter, but they still maintain their insulin sensitivity, which means they can continue to get fat as it's continuing to get stored in small fat cells. In fact, we see this even in clinical practice. One of the most effective anti-diabetic drugs, so a drug that would be prescribed to someone with type 2 diabetes, who almost always is going to be a little overweight, and there's very much an ethnic component to that, but even still, they may be prescribed a class of drug called a thiazolidinedione, or a TZD. These drugs will improve their insulin sensitivity very, very well. But paradoxically, because it makes them fatter, it actually stimulates their body's ability to make new fat cells. And so on one hand, they have this situation where they're getting fatter and fatter with every dose they're taking every month. And yet at the same time, their diabetes is getting better. It's because they're allowing the big hypertrophic fat cells to start sharing some of that burden with the new fat cells. And so I'm such an advocate of the idea of people acknowledging this by stating it's not the mass of fat we have that matters most when it comes to insulin resistance. It's how you're storing your fat. Are you storing your fat in hypertrophic, fewer but fatter fat cells, or more abundant, or hyperplastic, more abundant but smaller fat cells? And this is very much at the heart of why across the spectrum of ethnicities, why on one hand you have, say, a Chinese ethnicity man who has among the lowest tolerances to store fat. The Chinese typically, on average, that body type has a very limited number of fat cells. And so if that person is eating a diet where insulin is stimulated and to stimulate the growth of the fat, and there's sufficient calories to fuel that growth, because you need both of them, you can't have fat growth without both of those, then he has a very low threshold of fat gain. A little bit of fat on his body, he's just mildly chubby and he already is pre-diabetic, he has hypertension, he has fatty liver disease. On the far other end of the spectrum, you have the typical Caucasian kind of Northern European ethnicity, which is the most abundant ethnicity in the US, me and you included. That is an ethnicity, that's a body type that has a slightly higher potential to make new fat cells. And so that's a body type where he got just as fat as his Chinese buddy, and yet he's still fine. He just doesn't look as good in his Speedo as he used to. But he doesn't have any sign of fatty liver disease or any sign of prediabetes, but he's just as fat as his old Chinese college roommate was. That's the personal fat threshold idea, but again, it's not because a person reaches a particular mass of fat. You would basically ask the question, how full are your fat cells? And the moment those fat cells are full, now those fat cells become insulin resistant and they become pro-inflammatory to try to correct blood flow, which is a different issue. But the combination of those variables basically leads to that being the first domino to fall along this cascade, and then the liver becomes insulin resistant, the muscle, etc.
Is that why, like, for example, like gluteal femoral fat is considered more protective?
Mm-hmm. I
don't want to say protective, but it's...
it absolutely is. I think it's an appropriate word to use. In fact, it allows me to come back to what I'd alluded to, where in women, you have higher levels of estrogens, and estrogens signal a greater subcutaneous hyperplasia. So particularly on the butt and hips, or with these higher levels of estradiol in particular, the sex hormones tell the body where to store fat and even how. It's still insulin that tells the body how much fat to store, but again, sufficient calories to fuel that storage. But the sex hormones tell the body where to store fat. And so as estradiol levels are higher, it signals more hyperplasia of that fat beneath the skin, which is absolutely a healthy, protective place to store fat. And it is more hyperplastic. So much to the woman's chagrin, she has the ability to get fatter at her butt and hips, and yet it keeps her healthier. But that's what transitions with menopause. As her estradiol levels, the estrogens start to come down. I like to joke when I teach endocrinology to my students that at that point, the woman becomes a metabolic mortal. That prior to that, she is she's bulletproof metabolically. She is fatter than her male counterpart at every point in her life, and yet she's healthier in every cardiometabolic marker than her male counterpart is. After menopause, now she's immortal. Now, if she has as much fat as her male counterpart does, it's going to start to cause cardiometabolic problems because she doesn't store it as much in that subcutaneous space at the butt and hips. It begins to be more stored centrally, just like it is on her male counterpart.
So how come today we're seeing more like apple-shaped women than we were even 20 years ago? Like, what's different in younger women now? Is it just like an accelerated aging effect that's kind of happening with insulin resistance?
Yeah.
What's happening there,
in
your opinion?
Yeah. So I do have to speculate. I would suspect it's in part due to a greater consumption of fructose. There are some nutrients that are metabolized, let's say poorly, if you will, that lead to altered fat storage. So there was a study done in humans, males and females, that gave them isocaloric drinks of high glucose or high fructose. Both gained some degree of fat during the course of the study, but where they gained the fat was totally different. The high glucose drinkers gained relatively more subcutaneous fat, so the pinchable, jiggable fat, which generally predominates on the female body, whereas the fructose drinking population had more visceral adipose. So at a minimum, I suspect part of it could be the effect of how the liver in particular is metabolizing fructose and then dumping that fructose turned into fat into that kind of portal circulation, which is going to feed through visceral adipocytes first. So even still, that's speculative, but we know for a fact in humans, all calories equal, well, they're not, but fructose consumption will selectively promote greater visceral adipose storage. And of course, fructose, that's not only, like from fruit juice, but even sugar, of course. Any enriched source of fructose would have the potential to contribute to that.
벤 비크먼 박사는 지방세포의 크기와 저장 위치가 건강에 미치는 영향에 대해 이야기했는데요. 이를 통해 우리는 동양인이 서양인보다 날씬한데도 당뇨병이 잘 걸리는 이유, 그리고 여성이 남성보다 일반적으로 건강하지만 폐경기 이후에는 대사적 문제가 증가하는 원인에 대해 깊이 이해할 수 있습니다. 이러한 개념은 다른 키토 전문가들은 깊이 다루지 않는 그만의 독보적인 전문 분야라고 볼 수 있습니다. 물론 학문적으로 이런 지식을 가진 과학자들은 많겠지만 이처럼 일반인의 관점에서 이해하기 쉽게 전달하는 사람은 거의 없습니다. 바로 이것이 그가 키토 커뮤니티에서 주목받고 높이 평가받는 이유라 할 수 있겠습니다. 이제 주제는 과당으로 넘어갑니다. 과당은 혈당 수치를 급격히 높이지 않기 때문에 포도당보다 낫다고 생각하는 사람이 많습니다. 하지만 과당이 우리 몸에서 대사되는 방식을 보면 오히려 더 위험할 수 있습니다. 과당은 과일뿐 아니라 설탕에도 들어있습니다. 설탕은 포도당과 과당이 결합된 형태거든요. 과당은 포도당과는 완전히 다른 방식으로 대사됩니다. 포도당은 우리 몸의 거의 모든 세포가 곧바로 에너지원으로 사용할 수 있지만 과당은 오직 간에서만 처리됩니다. 이것은 마치 소규모 공장이 감당할 수 없는 물량을 한꺼번에 받는 것과 같습니다. 즉, 간은 과당을 감당할 수 있는 속도보다 더 빨리 처리해야 하고 결국 과당은 지방, 특히 내장지방으로 저장되는 경향이 강해집니다. 이로 인해 발생하는 건강 문제는 지방간이 대표적입니다. 최근 아동들에게서 비알코올성 지방간이 증가하고 있다고 하는데요. 술도 안 먹는 아이들에게서 왜 지방간이 나타날까요? 이 역시 과도한 설탕 섭취가 주요 원인으로 꼽히고 있습니다. 계속해서 그의 이야기를 들어보겠습니다.
Is there sort of an upper threshold of fructose, or is it really genetically dependent? Like, I mean, can some people, since fructose isn't really involved in glycogen resynthesis of the muscle or anything like that, like you can't necessarily exercise your way out of that in a lot of ways. Yet, you've got people that are athletes that consume a fair bit of fructose, yet they still have good cardiometabolic parameters and good biomarkers, and they don't have. So is it somewhat bio-individual? Is there a rough number where, hey, like, because I know, like, if you're eating just fruit, it's kind of hard to reach a ridiculous amount of fructose.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So that's a great question. And I don't really have my finger on the pulse of that research enough, but I'll speculate because I'm a professor and I'm used to speculating. In this case, I would say that it's interesting to me to note people who have become advocates of consuming high fructose sources, they're always lean and healthy. So I don't know that there is an inherent genetic ability to tolerate fructose a little better, although there certainly could be. We know that there are certain groups of people who metabolize alcohol better. And why would I even invoke alcohol? The one similarity between fructose and alcohol is that they both primarily rely on the liver for their metabolism. So just as we know there are people who are able to more rapidly metabolize alcohol, it wouldn't surprise me if there are people who can more rapidly metabolize and tolerate fructose. But even still, I do think it's important to control the dose. That whole fruit, for me, one of the first cardinal rules of eating a diet to improve insulin sensitivity is control carbs. And when I invoke that mantra, it really is to help people understand the value of whole fruits and vegetables, not juiced fruits and vegetables. And I think that's the divider. If this is a population or a person who's eating whole fruit, then I generally would give that a thumbs up, depending on where they're coming from. If this is an overweight, severely type 2 diabetic, there may be some fruits that would be a little more problematic than others, but any would be better than drinking the fruit.
사회자는 다이어트를 고민하는 사람들이 궁금해할 만한, 그러나 평소에는 잘 다뤄지지 않는 질문을 던지고 있습니다. 이 때문에 벤 비크먼 박사도 연구 기반이 아닌 자신의 지식과 경험을 바탕으로 조심스럽게 추측을 하며 답변을 이어가고 있는데요. 이 과정에서 그가 인체의 대사에 관해 얼마나 깊은 통찰을 가지고 있는지 확인할 수 있습니다. 특히 흥미로웠던 점은 비크먼 박사가 과당 대사 능력의 개인차를 알코올 대사 능력의 차이와 비교하며 설명했다는 것입니다. 사람마다 알코올 분해 능력의 차이가 있듯이 과당을 대사하는 능력도 유전적 요인에 따라 다를 수 있다는 것이죠. 물론 이 이야기는 명확한 연구를 바탕으로 하지 않았고 비크먼 박사 역시 가능성이 있다는 정도로 조심스럽게 제기한 가설이지만 두 가지 물질 모두 간에서 대사된다는 점을 고려하면 충분히 설득력 있는 주장입니다. 그런데 제가 관련 연구를 찾아보니 텍사스 대학 건강과학센터에서 발표한 리뷰 논문에서도 실제로 개인별 유전적 차이가 과당 대사에 영향을 줄 수 있다는 점이 언급되었습니다. 이는 개인별로 과당 섭취에 대한 대사 반응이 다를 수 있음을 시사합니다. 이제 사회자는 다시 인슐린이라는 기존 주제로 돌아가 더욱 흥미로운 질문을 이어갑니다.
Yeah, I want to bounce back just before I forget. Two questions on the insulin piece with sort of suppressing lipolysis. Is it a dimmer switch more so than a light switch? And if it is a dimmer switch, does it, as you start to crank it up or down, does it gain more momentum as you're cranking it up to 11? If you have an insulin release and its ability to allow fat into a young or a new fat or a small fat cell, when you have a little bit of insulin, is there a little bit of momentum, and does it increase? Does it kind of gain momentum with more?
Yeah, that's a good question. So to answer the first part of the question very definitively, it is absolutely a dimmer. Yeah. It is completely a function of degrees. And you can titrate this beautifully in like living, breathing humans. You can monitor this over time, where the product of lipolysis, so when we're talking about breaking down the fat from the fat cell, the stored form of the fat in the fat cell is triglycerides. The product of the lipolysis is free fatty acids. And you can get this measured on a blood test, albeit it's not uncommonly. However, my point about the kind of titrating or the changing the dose, if insulin skyrockets, give that body a few minutes, and if you're measuring free fatty acids, the free fatty acids plummet and go to almost undetectable very, very quickly. In contrast, the more you give the body time to allow the insulin to come down, and the fastest way to do that, of course, is fasting. So if a fast starts from this point of really high insulin and essentially no lipolysis, so free fatty acids basically baseline, and then the more time you're giving them, you can see this beautiful crossover. And Dr. George Cahill, a legend in the field of fasting, or what he called starvation research, we would call it fasting, he really has published some beautiful papers that show these kinds of figures, where when insulin would start to get to around 10 microunits per mil, you could immediately start to see this reduction. So the insulin's coming up, you'd start to see this reduction in the free fatty acids. But then back to the paradigm I'd outlined a moment ago, if you take a fed individual and start fasting them, as insulin starts coming down, you can see this steady decline hour after hour of the free fatty acids coming up. There's an interesting test that someone can do at home. So I've presented the viewpoint that the first cell or tissue that becomes insulin resistant is the fat cell, and I defend that vigorously. Because of this, you can actually combine the two variables that I just mentioned into what I consider to be one of the best tests for detecting insulin resistance at the earliest possible stage. In other words, the moment it's starting at the fat cells. So as we go back to that hypertrophic fat cell, as it starts to become insulin resistant, insulin levels are high. There's no such thing as insulin resistance without elevated insulin. You cannot pull those two apart. If it's insulin resistance, insulin levels are high. Well, with what I just mentioned, if insulin levels are high, we would expect free fatty acids to be low, unless the fat cells have become hypertrophic and now they're insulin resistant. Now we have this metabolic oddity where both insulin is elevated and free fatty acids are elevated. This is a particularly pathogenic state because while the fat cells are full and they can't handle anymore, if insulin is up, you can't burn that fat. Normally, you only have high free fatty acids when insulin is low, and because insulin is low, you can now burn it. Beta oxidation, or the burning of the fat, is just going like gangbusters. So much so that you're burning more than you need, and you start making ketones, which is a different topic. But if you have both high insulin and high free fatty acids, now you start storing those free fatty acids in tissues that are ill-suited for long-term fat storage. This is this idea of ectopic fat deposition, where now you're storing fat in your muscles, in your pancreas, in your liver. So you have all of these fatty deposits in tissues that are not designed to store fat, but it's because when you have high insulin and high free fatty acids, you can't burn that fat. You have to store it. It's just you can't store it in the fat tissue anymore.
여기서 간단히 정리하고 넘어가겠습니다. 보통 인슐린 수치가 높아지면 지방이 지방세포 속에 저장되면서 혈중 유리지방산 수치는 낮아집니다. 반대로 인슐린 수치가 낮아지면 지방이 분해되면서 지방산이 세포에서 빠져나오기 때문에 혈중 유리지방산 수치는 증가합니다. 그런데 문제는 지방세포가 꽉 차버린 경우입니다. 이 경우 인슐린이 높아도 지방이 지방세포에 더 이상 저장되지 못하고 혈중 지방산이 여전히 높은 상태가 됩니다. 이는 마치 가득 찬 물컵에 더 이상 물을 부을 수 없는 상황과 같습니다. 컵의 용량은 정해져 있기 때문에 아무리 더 부어봤자 물은 넘쳐 흐르게 되죠. 지방산도 마찬가지입니다. 그래서 저장 공간이 꽉 차 있기 때문에 지방이 넘쳐 흘러 결국 장기 곳곳에 쌓이게 되는데 이것이 바로 이소성지방입니다. 보통 지방은 피하지방으로 저장되는 것이 정상적이지만 이소성지방은 근육, 간, 췌장과 같은 주요 장기에 비정상적으로 축적됩니다. 문제는 이러한 장기들은 원래 지방을 저장하도록 설계되지 않았다는 것입니다. 그래서 이소성 지방이 장기에 축적되면 여러 대사적 문제가 발생합니다. 췌장에 지방이 축적되면 인슐린 분비 기능이 저하되어 당뇨병 위험이 커집니다. 근육 속 지방은 인슐린 저항성을 증가시켜 지방 연소가 더 어려워지고 결과적으로 체지방이 쉽게 축적되는 체질로 변하게 됩니다. 이제 사회자는 이 이론을 실생활에서 어떻게 적용할 수 있을지 보다 현실적인 질문을 이어나갑니다.
Does the same thing apply with high amounts of co-ingestion of fats and carbs together at the same time, or do we have a way to partition?
That's a great question. If you have a lot of fat and carb together, that is a particularly fattening mix.